All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Baybars Örsek, and Baybars is the director of the International Fact-Checking Network at the Poynter Institute. Baybars, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Chase, for the invite and, doing this. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we first met about a month ago and had a great conversation about your home country of Turkey, where I've done some traveling. And I think we should start there because you are now leading what is kind of like the king of all fact-checking programs internationally. And I think it'd be interesting to start with kind of how you got here, because you're now running the International Fact-Checking Network, also known as the IFCN, which we'll probably refer to as throughout the podcast, which is the premier global coalition of fact-checking projects. And you guys really do work around promoting best practices in the industry. So let's start with your first kind of foray into fact-checking. You started the first fact-checking organization in Turkey in 2014, if I'm correct. Can you tell us why you did that and what that was?
Sure. First of all, there was no other organization in Turkey doing the practice at the time. Fact-checking was relatively new, even in parts of the world where we had a tradition of journalism, investigative journalism. Fact-checking was becoming a new area of work for journalists. So in Turkey, that was even much more problematic. So back in 2014, right after the popular Gezi Park protests in the country, where we had a months-long confrontation between this activists, protesters, and the government. It came to my attention that we could have done a better job in providing accurate information to people who are more interested in getting reliable information on what's happening on the ground. Because in a country where the media was polarized as the politics, it was a big need to have an organization, Doğruluk Payı, which was the first organization in Turkey in fact-checking. And with a couple of my friends, none of us were coming from journalism necessarily, but we were able to build a team together and provide the first example of fact-checking in Turkey. And if I'm not mistaken, also in the Middle East and North Africa region, as well as in the East Europe, except a couple of organizations in Bosnia, Serbia, and Slovenia. So it was a very, early example of the need to provide more accurate information to the public.
Cool. And then I'm sure that project must have gone well, because soon after that you began advising the IFCN. Is that right?
True. Our founding director, Alexis Manzarlis, suggested the idea of setting up an advisory board in 2016. And I was one of the first advisory board members, along with 6 other colleagues from different parts of the world. We had Glenn Kasser from the Washington Post, Angie Holland from PolitiFact, Peter Cunliffe-Jones, the founder of Africa Check, Govind Etraj from India, Phoebe Arnold from UK. It was a very diverse group with Laura Zauber from Argentina, the Chiquada. So I was fortunate enough to be in that cohort and be more involved in the daily activities of our code of principles, as well as some of the big picture discussions that our director was bringing us into the conversation. So that was a big segue for me to be more involved in the broader practice of fact-checking, not necessarily just focusing on what's happening in Turkey, but also how we could bring that knowledge to different parts of the world and help organizations to do good journalism, good fact-checking in such challenging circumstances.
And when you were still just an advisor to the board, were you doing that advising from Turkey, or had you made it into the United States at that point?
Yeah, at the time, all of the advisory board members and still have been doing this for basically, it was not a professional position. So the 7 advisory board members were non-paid volunteer members of the IFCN, board members of the IFCN. So we were basically convening in virtual settings, starting from late 2016. And every year with the Global Fact Conferences, we were also able to, come together and learn from one another during the Global Fact conversations, Global Fact panels. And also as the board, we were also having separate conversations about the code of principles, about the future global facts, and how fact checkers could work with tech companies in a way where they could have more, fair and sustainable partnership model. So it was a work that I was doing from Turkey remotely.
And they must have liked what you were saying when you were advising, because then they made you the director. And I want to talk now about the IFCN. So you guys are not fact checkers. Can you clarify exactly what you are and what you do?
True, we don't necessarily publish fact checks on a daily basis, even though we have a team of 5 right now, all at the Poynter Institute where we are based at. And we have, along with my colleagues, Kristina Tardegula, one of the best fact checkers in the world, the founder of Agência Lupa in Brazil, along with our reporter Harrison Montes, our program manager for the Baybars Örsek, and our recent hire Elena Dvorak for our new international program manager. We don't do fact check necessarily every single day, but we do work with fact checking organizations, regardless of their geography, and try to provide them the capacity so they could work with other fact checkers in a much more collaborative way. I mean, one of the recent works that we have done was the Coronavirus Facts Alliance, where we were able to bring together almost more than 100 fact-checking organizations around the world and build the largest database of fact checks on COVID-19 falsehoods. So we do more along the lines of try to help the organization along the lines of bringing them together, providing them with the platform so they could do their job and they can amplify their work by the support and help that we could bring together from different stakeholders. And even more recently than that, with the US elections, during the US elections, we initiated a fact-checking chatbot on WhatsApp to bring together 10 US fact-checking organizations, along with the 2 largest Spanish broadcasters in the country, Telemundo and Univision, and offer the US fact-checkers fact checks, English language fact checks into Spanish. And our Spanish language broadcasters, Telemundo and Univision, redistributing those fact checks and translating those fact checks initially, and trying to reach to the Hispanic community in the country to provide them with more accurate information on election integrity, election safety. So we do try to help other organizations to do better fact-checking by encouraging higher standards, making sure they adhere to our code of principles, and then we can endorse their work, which eventually are a big asset for them, given the fact that many tech companies prefer to work exclusively with Ifcn's verified signatories. So we concentrate our efforts more on those lines.
Yeah, so let me try to kind of summarize how I think of the IFCN. You guys are creating a structured format for how fact checks should look and operate inside of, as far as data and as far as interacting with other technologies, so that they can then get approved by you all at the IFCN through passing a certain code of principles, which maybe we'll get into. And if they pass those code of principles, then they can use the IFCN to structure their data. And then the IFCN kind of works as a middleman to help get those fact checks to the big technology and social media platforms that everybody is getting their news from today. So you guys are creating that kind of structured format for the fact checks so that the technology companies can just integrate them into their at-scale platforms.
We are not there yet, but you basically, pointed out that perfectly. That's the way that we would like to go. Right now, I'm more comfortable to say that IFCN basically tries to serve as like a crossroads for fact checkers, tech companies, even for researchers, folks from different journalistic backgrounds, and make sure we can serve our stakeholders, our fact checking organizations, our partners in different tech circles, to get the most out of fact checking, which is actually a public good, a service for the public good, and make sure the fact checkers are able to make some of those decisions collectively, vis-a-vis their relationship with tech companies, how they would like their data to be distributed, and how we as a fact-checking community, the global fact-checking community, can basically push for higher standards. And I think there's an important caveat that I feel like I need to make there. Like the roots of the global fact-checking movement goes even earlier than the establishment of the IFCN. The first global fact at the time, I'm not sure if it was called the Global Fact, but I think it was called the International Fact-Checking Conference in 2013 and 2014. For two consecutive years, a group of fact-checkers gathered together in London, in the United Kingdom, to basically, meet with each other and, form that kind of feeling of community. And after the third conference, which happened in Buenos Aires, the decision was to establish the International Fact-Checking Network as the umbrella organization for fact checkers, and then eventually launched the Credder Principles, which now serves as the entry point to our network, which is a set of criteria and applications process, followed by assessment and also independent review. But I think we will come down to that in much more detail. But we try to basically empower the organizations in our network to have those conversations more structured, more collectively, and eventually make the decision collectively. Therefore, they can have a longer sustainable relationship with their funders, with their partners in different tech companies, and also most importantly with their audiences, which is based on trust when it comes to fact checking, which should be based on trust when it comes to fact checking.
Right. That's actually something I wanted to talk to you about, is trust in fact checkers and fact checking in general. Do you think that fact checkers are more trusted today than publishers themselves, or are they kind of have a similar level of trust? How do you think about that?
That's a great question, Chase. We have been thinking about running a project to study the impact of fact checking, the badge of Ifcn on our fact checking websites, and whether how that translates into trust with their audiences. That's something that we are actually working on right now to get that understanding much more evidence-based. But our primary goal is basically to make sure that fact checkers at the end of the day should be accountable to their readers. And there is one question that every fact checker hears at least once in a while, which is, who fact checks the fact checkers? So our goal in terms of responding that question is, readers should fact check the fact checkers. The users, the consumers, needs consumers should fact check the fact checkers. No one should take the trust and for granted when it comes to communicating, consuming information from fact checkers. They need to go through their websites, make sure they have a methodology that they tell their users how to do their fact checks, how to choose the stories or the claims that they do fact check, and who does the fact checks in those teams, who are the editorial, who's the editorial team, who pays the bills. It's also an important question. Organizations should be transparent about their funding sources and how they run the business in their organizations. And some of the signals that journalism have been the journalism field has been able to, build together, such as the transparency in terms of your resources, your corrections policy should be a part of fact checkers, daily diet. So users, the readers, can hold those fact checking organizations accountable for their work. So we don't expect any user, any reader to take fact checkers' word for its face value. They need to go through and do their own assessment that those fact checking organizations are genuinely non-biased and independent organization. Because one of the biggest challenges that we have right now in this field is that since this fact checking work comes with that high expectation, many bad actors are also claiming that they are still doing fact checking, which actually is not true. So we also want to make sure users have the enough resources to see which is a good fact checking organization and which one is not.
Yeah, obviously at Credder, we completely agree that ultimately the news consumers are going to have to hold the fact checkers and the publications accountable. I'm glad to hear you saying that too. Would the IFCN ever consider kicking out a fact checker out of the program, out of the network, if they disagreed or found kind of false fact checks?
We have had dispelled an organization from the network in the past. It was before my tenure here, my term here, but I mean, I was at the advisory board at the time. So we had we had to expel one organization due to their failure in disclosing one of their funding sources. We expect organizations to disclose their funding sources if it is more than 5% of their yearly annual revenue, and that organization failed to do that. And there's no harm in calling them out, because unfortunately, after being expelled by the network, probably coincidentally, they also shut down, which is never a good news when it comes to journalism. The Weekly Standard was the organization that we had to basically expel from the network, given the fact that they failed to disclose a big chunk of their funding sources in their application.
So they were kicked out not necessarily because of malpractice around the fact checks, but just because of a problem with one of those initial code of principles.
Right. So we don't necessarily put so much emphasis on daily, like individual fact checks. It is obviously a big part of our focus. But when it comes to violations of our code of principles, those are the ones that we take into account when it comes to launching an investigation, even consider kicking that organization out. So those violations to the code of principles are the ones that we have had in the past exercised to basically remove one of our signatories from our certified organizations. On the other hand, when we receive complaints from readers, from publishers, towards fact-checking organizations' work and individual work, we mostly encourage the readers to reach out to the organization. And on our website, we also have that complaints page where we basically facilitate that communication. So whenever we receive a complaint against one of our verified signatories, as long as we don't see it's spam, because that happens a lot, we receive so much spam complaints. As long as we mark that complaint as legitimate, we make sure the signatory is aware of that complaint. And what we do later is that if that organization will go through a renewal, which, by the way, all of our verified signatures have to go through renewal every year. So in practical terms, when they go to renewal in the next application term that they have, those complaints are also shaped by their assessors. So we ask the assessors to also go through those complaints and make sure those complaints have been addressed by the applicant verified signatory. So we have that system where we try to facilitate that conversation between the publishers and the signatories. But when it comes to strong violations of our code of principles, that's where we are more eager to take a stance and make a judgment on the future of the organization.
Okay, and when the IFCN goes to somebody like WhatsApp, or WhatsApp comes to you, and you guys decide to work together on something like fact checking in the lead up to the election, is WhatsApp signing on to use every fact checker that's in your network, or do they in some ways get to pick and choose?
I probably should basically start with how Facebook works with our verified signatories and with us in that sense, and maybe we can also relate that to WhatsApp. So being a verified signatory, which might also seen as like being our member, is a necessary condition to work with Facebook in their third-party fact-checking program, but it's not a sufficient criteria. So Facebook works exclusively with IFCN's verified signatures, but they don't work with 100% of them. They have been launching new partnerships with new organizations lately. So the number of organizations that haven't had started working with Facebook is relatively low, but there are still organizations in our network that don't work with Facebook. So at the end of the day, Facebook has the ultimate right to extend an offer to an organization. And at times, organizations might also choose not to work with Facebook, given their own conditions or reservations as well. So there's no rule that all IFCN's verified signatures will work with Facebook. It is a decision that is up to Facebook and the individual fact-checking organizations. In the case of WhatsApp, it's the same. WhatsApp also exclusively works with IFCN's verified signatures, but they don't work with all of them. But in our one-on-one relationship with WhatsApp, which we had back in the first couple of months of the pandemic with the Coronavirus Fact Checking Alliance chatbot and the US elections chatbot. We basically brought together those alliances, and WhatsApp basically, gave the green light for those organizations to appear on those chatbots, given the fact that they were all Ifcn verified signatures.
Okay, and let's take an example here. Let's say WhatsApp's working with Ifcn. They've chosen a couple fact checkers to pull those fact checks into the kind of chat, like you said, fact chat, one of your guys' programs. What happens if two of the fact checkers that WhatsApp's using disagree with each other on a fact check?
It's normal. It happens on Facebook's program as well. There are instances where that might happen, because at the end of the day, part of fact checking is also driven by basic journalism practices, and it is extremely rare that a same claim or story is fact checked by two different organizations and they have like two opposite verdicts. One have like a false, one has one has a false, one has a true. That doesn't happen too much. It is extremely rare, but there might be cases where one organization might find something mostly true while other finds it true. So there might be some differences in the categorization of those verdicts. In those cases, both companies, to my best of my knowledge, provides the context to their users based on, I guess, their own algorithms. So I don't necessarily know how Facebook deals with cases where they have two contradicting, verdicts. But in the case of WhatsApp, it's a bit different because the chatbots that we have with WhatsApp basically serves as like a repository of fact checks rather than imposing in a label to users, showing in a labels to users. So it's a bit different than how Facebook works with their third-party fact checking program. So on WhatsApp, basically, you just see organization X has this verdict while organization Z has this verdict, instead of Facebook's exposure of labels. WhatsApp, basically, the chatbot experiences that we have with WhatsApp basically serves the fact checks from the participating organizations.
That's cool. So in a recent podcast I had with David Smook, who's the founder and CEO of Hacker Noon, we were brainstorming ideas of how to maybe best display these types of fact checks or context on top of content in the news feeds on these various platforms. And we kind of came to the conclusion that one of the best ways to do it would be to allow users to kind of click to have a drop down where they could opt in or out of different fact checkers. So for example, if for some reason I really don't trust a particular fact checker, I can stop seeing them in my feed, but maybe I haven't been seeing another fact checker and I'd like to start opting in for their fact checks. Do you think that that's a good solution for users to kind of have some control over which fact checks they see? Or should it be up to
I mean, that's a very healthy conversation, and I would be more than happy to hear some of the evidences that backs up the need, like the impact that might be there. But my initial observation when it comes to labels is that it serves users basically to before sharing content they see as labeled as misleading. That friction is actually very helpful in terms of limiting the spread of misinformation. We still have so much challenges in terms of the scalability of fact checking. So I would be more advocating for a broader, a universal exposure of labels coming from reliable and authoritative sources. In this case, fact checkers, so be it. They basically, have at least share a certain level of criteria when it comes to their transparency and accountability. I definitely believe there's value in making sure the users can see multiple fact checks from different organizations if there are more than one fact checks on that particular content. But on the other hand, it would be always a limiting experience for users if they eventually, blacklist an organization that they disagree with, but there will be other, probably cases where they would be more willing to consume and, be more receptive to those fact checks from the same organization. Because in many cases, users might be a bit more resistant to consume such or be more receptive to those information, context, additional context. But at the end of the day, fact checkers are basically doing fact checks every single day from different variety of different topics. And there will be always areas where times where users are not agreeing with fact checkers, but that doesn't mean the fact checks are necessarily wrong or bad. It is just that that user doesn't seem to be welcoming that intervention at that time.
Yeah, it seems like consumers and the industry at large seem to be coming to the conclusion that they should stop censoring content and just add more labels, add more context. Is that what you agree is happening and is the right path forward, these kind of adding contextual information instead of having to just censor content?
I think there's a big distinction that we need to make there, which is, an additional focus would be really helpful to make sure what is harmful misinformation, what is not harmful. Everybody, in my personal view, has the right to believe whatever they want. I mean, they can believe in, flying unicorns, or just like, they can believe that the moon landing was fake. But as long as that doesn't hurt other people's quality of news consumptions, then they're fine to do so. But when it comes to posting those stuff on the internet that can harm people, that has a big impact on people's daily lives. I mean, particularly with the whole falsehoods around COVID-19, we have been reading reports where people are going to hospitals and they are even like rejecting the doctors' assessments on their health and rejecting to take the medicine or the treatment. And in many cases, they're all fueled by the misinformation that they see on the internet. So such, harmful misinformation, I believe, should be stopped. I don't feel comfortable in calling that as censorship. But as long as people are protected with such harmful misinformation, there will be always more room to discuss how in other cases of misinformation where it's not necessarily harmful, people might be more willing to just see advisory label or edit context. But when it comes to misinformation that can cause real life harm, we should be very careful. And I think what we have not been able to do so far as the industry is that we haven't been able to identify what is harmful misinformation. That's a big problem that I see. I think we still have different platforms have different understanding of what is harmful misinformation. Even new social media platforms are basically having this off-the-counter definitions of harmful misinformation, but it's still relatively new field in terms of content moderation needs for those social media companies. And we as the industry at large, as you said, and with different stakeholders, with the researchers, should be able to provide more evidence-based study and research to provide this provide this knowledge with the tech companies to make sure we can hold them accountable in terms of how they identify what is harmful misinformation and how they can apply those rules globally, not just in the US or in any other country during elections where the stakes are high for those internet companies, but for the global community that can be more protected against harmful misinformation. I mean, harmful misinformation can cause real life harm. In Myanmar in 2017, even Facebook later have acknowledged that their lack of responding to misinformation in Myanmar caused a genocide. So we should be very careful about how we identify those definitions with more participation from different stakeholders and make sure we don't allow the bad actors to basically pollute our information system and cause real life harm, which is unfortunately very tragic.
So let's assume for a second that we do come up with some kind of standardization around what harmful misinformation is. Would that be something that the IFCN is looking to kind of be the standard bearer for that as well? Or do you think it's going to ultimately be decisions made by the platforms themselves?
We can only be an actor, an asset to those who are willing to explore such, definitions, such conversations. I think it should be a broader goal, which I already see is already a broader goal for the academy, for researchers, for internet companies, for fact checkers, for journalists, for activists on the ground, for anyone involved in our information ecosystem should be playing a role in those conversations. So we don't see ourselves in a position to provide a template definition of what is harmful misinformation, because it's very, cultural specific, it's very country specific, it's very language specific. So we should be able to bring together different feedback, different inputs from the community. We already do that actually, as far as communicating these feedbacks from our organizations from 58 different countries. In the network right now, we have 82 verified signatories, and they come from 58 different countries, which means we have information coming through from those 58 different countries, and the number is growing. So during our Global Fact conferences, during our community meetings, during our one-on-one exchanges with those tech companies, we always put so much emphasis on bringing that feedback so it can be used for good, and also to amplify more research on this area. This is something that we also try to do. I think that's something that we can collectively contribute and make sure there's a big consensus on how we identify those, that terminology. Because if you take it seriously, I think we all try to just shape the future of the internet here all together, and we all have a big responsibility to do that, to make sure we will have a healthy and basically just a healthy and reliable discourse, a global discourse.
Right. And so one thing I wanted to talk about was actually that responsibility. So as you mentioned, Facebook has a direct relationship with the IFCN in that they are only featuring fact checks that have been approved as, your signatories. That's a lot of power. And in some ways, IFCN is kind of like a gatekeeper for, the fact checks that we all see across the world. Obviously, Poynter is a 501c3 nonprofit and has a rich history of great work in journalism. And I know you take the responsibility very seriously, but how do you think about this? Just the fact that you have kind of a very powerful seat at the information table.
That's true, and I don't suggest anyone to try to claim this responsibility. But I'm very fortunate to say that this is a responsibility that I don't play individually. One of the things that I find it very reassuring is that all the changes, all the advancements, the progress that we have within our code of principles is actually a result of collective conversation. So we recently have updated our code of principles. The attached criteria to our code of principles have been updated in late March this year. So it was a process of a year with rigorous conversation with all the fact checkers in our network, constant feedback from our partners in different tech companies, feedback from the academy, and those changes have been implemented in a way that the fact-checking community itself has agreed to those terms and empowered IFCN to basically act as the secretariat for that, seek of higher standards in our field. So it is not that we shared a set of criteria or expectations and ask everyone to abide by. That's not what we do. What we do is basically act as the hub for that flow of feedback and information and knowledge, so we can all together as a fact-checking community can seek for higher standards in this field and self-regulate our work. Because we have been probably one of the very few examples in the journalistic world, don't fact check me on that, but I think it's fair to say that I think we were one of the very early examples of a community that wanted to self-regulate itself. So that gives me the confidence that we are doing the right job. We don't obviously do it perfect. It's always a constant seek for better. I think it's fair to say that our code of principles is the floor when it comes to higher standards in the fact checking. It's definitely not the ceiling. Every single day we are surprised, not surprised, impressed by the work that our fact-checking organizations do around the world when it comes to showing their transparency, being accountable to their readers, carrying out the best practices. So we also share those best practices with the rest of the community to make sure we can collectively increase the quality in our network. Having said those, yes, that's true. The Ifcn at the end of the day as an institution, as part of the Poynter Institute, holds that gatekeeper role. But with our advisory board, which we were able to grow from 7 to 15 lately, with our bylaws, with our public chapter that we have introduced late September, we are trying to make sure that we, with the all utmost transparency, can basically, encourage the rest of the community to seek for the same goal, and basically, make sure that we are doing a right job, a good job in providing the industry with a list of organizations that we believe, after a rigorous application and evaluation process, that we believe are above certain standards.
Yeah, like you said, the Ifcn was the first to start doing this, first to try to start creating the standardization around the fact checkers, and you guys are the biggest and the most well-connected. Are you guys seeing any competitors? Is there anybody else? I haven't seen anyone, but is anybody else kind of trying to do something like what you're doing?
Not that I'm aware of. There are regional organizations that are bringing fact-checking organizations together, but almost all of them are basically, in very close relationship with Ifcn, because their founding organizations are Ifcn verified signatories. In South America, we have Latam Checoa, which is a regional network launched by Checoado, the Argentine fact-checking organization, for the sake of bringing together the organizations in the region. We have similar initiatives in Africa, powered by Africa Check, in the Balkans, and lately in Southeast Asia. So those regional networks are basically working as like entities, loose networks to establish stronger relations between among their organizations. But in terms of like setting standards and representing the community, I think Ifcn is own organization in the fact-checking field.
Okay, cool. Let's turn for a second to some somewhat breaking news in the last couple of weeks here, which is the FTC's lawsuit against Facebook, to this antitrust lawsuit to possibly break Instagram and WhatsApp out of the Facebook brand family. I know these are your partners. I'm not going to try to get you to say anything bad or even necessarily positive about them. But if this were to happen, if Instagram and Facebook were to be pulled out of Facebook, if Instagram and WhatsApp were to be pulled out of Facebook, how would that affect the Ifcn? Would that make it harder to do your job because you already have this kind of direct relationship with Facebook and therefore their subsidiaries, or would it in some ways make the space better?
I don't think that will be like, something that I should be worried about in terms of like our daily, conversations or daily, practices, working with different brands, even within the same company, because at the end of the day, we already work with different tech companies in addition to Facebook. We have a good relationship with Google, with YouTube. We don't have like a similar fact-checking program that we have with Facebook, with those other tech companies, but growingly other tech companies also have been showing so much interest to work with fact checkers. We have just completed a project with YouTube lately to empower fact checking organizations with higher skills and resources to do better fact checking across different platforms. We are basically trying to encourage our partners on those companies to start working with fact checkers on a much more business, on a much more transactional ways, such as starting a new program similar to Facebook and others. But I mean, at the end of the day, our capacity is basically coming from the fact that we are able to communicate with different stakeholders at the same time. This is probably not something that I should be worried, in my personal capacity or institutional capacity, because at the end of the day, all of those relationships are actually, based on mutual interests. We provide, when I say we, it's the fact-checking community, provide a resource, an asset, an added value to the tech companies in a return of basically financial resources. So as long as there is this, win and win relationship between the tech companies and the fact-checking organizations that are ideally formed by collective decision-making processes within the fact-checking world, I think there will be always a need for tech companies to work with fact-checkers, even in higher capacities. So that's probably not going to be that big of a concern for me at this point to speculate about something that is in a judicial process right now.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm curious how the financial aspect of this works, because Poynter is a nonprofit, so you don't necessarily need to make money off of the work you're doing with these tech companies. But I'd imagine that the fact checkers who are getting used, their fact checks are getting used on these platforms would like some kind of a licensing deal or maybe some kind of a flat fee. Is there any kind of a payment structure that the Ifcn is helping kind of serve as the middleman for? Or are you saying, okay, here are the fact checks, now you guys go off and make your own deal together? How is there any money changing hands?
That's a good question. So traditionally, I will trace this back to late 2016 when the Facebook third-party fact-checking program started. It was actually a partnership, I will say, brokered by the Ifcn, but not necessarily carried out by the Ifcn. So in the early days, the fact-checking organizations were making their own agreements with Facebook, and that's still the case. So every organization working with Facebook has their own agreement with the company. So they, some of those have been, in practice for, multiple years. Some organizations have joined lately, but all of them have a similar, well, it's actually the identical, partnership when it comes to the way that they can provide the company with their fact checks. I can't, speculate more about the payments when it comes to individual organizations, but it is, it's a structured model that at least is identical in every single country. There are differences in different countries, the way that the program works, but in the essence that it's a global program, there is an integrity when it comes to the same standards on how you do fact checking. So we don't play that role, that middleman role. We don't play that with Facebook. We work with Facebook on different programs. So we recently have launched and completed actually 3 different grant programs with Facebook. We have had 2 innovation initiative grants with Facebook. One fact-checking flash grants during the first couple of months of the pandemic, again with Facebook. All of those grants were about more than $2 million in total. So we basically raised this funding directly from Facebook, and with our selection committee, we have distributed those grants to the applications that have demonstrated the capacity to carry out their projects. So we do those middleman positions, but not necessarily for the fact-checking work. So we do more capacity building related middleman kind of duty between those tech companies and fact checkers. We have done a very similar program with YouTube as well. But a mini model that we have tried with the WhatsApp fact-checking chatbot, I guess will shed some light on some of those conversations that we will be having in 2021 among the fact-checking community, which was we have paid more than $150,000 to around 70 organizations in the Coronavirus Fact-Checking Alliance for the work that they have done, for the number of fact checks that they have distributed, they have provided to our database. So we have tested such syndicate model with a group of fact-checking organizations. Well, more than actually, it's a very big group, with more than 70 organizations. So we have tested that. Lately, we have been also carrying out a number of structured conversations between our verified signatories and trying to understand where they stand in terms of the data governance that they, for their fact check. How we should be, as a fact checking community, we should be distributing our work to tech companies. I'm not saying this necessarily has to be done by an entity or an organization, but at the end of the day, the fact-checking organizations needs to decide how their fact check should be distributed to the tech companies, to researchers, to other media organizations, and in what terms they should be compensated with. So I believe the future of fact-checking is also one of my, basically mentor, and we call him as the dean of the fact-checking world, Bilader, pointed out in his Neiman Lab predictions, is structured data. The future of fact-checking is structured data. We should be seeing much more conversations around the importance of structured data, such as the claim review and the mid review that we have recently been working on, and the value that it translates to fact checkers, to tech companies, to researchers, and how we can move forward with some of our needs in automation, in distribution, and how we can build a sustainable business model for fact checkers for the years to come, for the work that they do, and how we can basically scale their work so we can gain more, front in this fight against the misinformation.
Yeah. Okay. And I just have a couple more questions for you here, but last question regarding fact checking is, how is fact checking different internationally than what we see in the US? And when I ask that, I mean, both how is the process of how fact checkers are doing their work differently, but also how are consumers, news consumers, responding to fact checks in other countries differently than maybe Americans respond to fact checkers?
That's a question that is very dear to my heart because, like, as someone that has done fact checking in Turkey for 5 years, I've always tried to understand what are the differences between different fact checking organizations in different parts of the world. I guess I'm fortunate enough to work in the same building with my folks from PolitiFact, because when we were basically brainstorming about starting this fact checking organization in Turkey, it was the PolitiFact's website that we was looking up to and trying to understand how they were basically doing their work every single day with their, promise tracking section, with their pundit, section. That was like the go-to resource for us at the time, along with organizations such as like Full Fact from the UK, Africa Check from Africa, because they were the only 3 organizations at the time, other than other US fact-checking organizations, obviously, that were publishing in English. So we were just trying to find English publishers, English fact-checking organizations, English language fact-checking organizations. And even at the time, we were able to see some differences. Like, some organizations use verdicts, ratings, some don't. Some organizations are more likely to, or more eager to go additional step to advocate for the work that they do, such as like policy change, such as like asking corrections from the people that they fact check, or even like, advocating for policy changes, not necessarily only changes in the behaviors of the political actors. But other organizations are finding it more impactful to be just publishers. So there are differences even in the different, aisles of, in the 2 sides of the Atlantic. On the other hand, like when you go to organizations, the Balkans, you see that they mostly come from organizations that are, come from nonprofit background, and they have also additional, projects that they do along with fact checking, such as like, investigative journalism or capacity building, or even things that are things that might be seen as like more activism work, but they have been doing great work in terms of like separating their work with, other parts of their job, and are more involved in, I would say, building a community, in asking more accountability and transparency from their elected officials, which you don't necessarily see that much in the US. Even in the US, there are so many differences. Let's take like Snopes, which was founded as like a newsletter, emails listserv back in early 2000s, and focus on the urban legends or the myths speaking in, in terms of the early 2000s. But on the other hand, you also have like the factcheck.org, which was mentioned in the vice presidential debate last month. So there is a big spectrum of organizations focusing on different parts of the world. And it's very inspiring to see that for example, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, you see more organizations, more working with local communities, doing more fact-checking on the local scale, building together a community with different, stakeholders to disseminate their work in the local scale, not necessarily relying only on on social media or digital tools, but doing, community door-to-door fact-checking with, weekly newsletters, newspapers. We also see similar cases in Africa. It's a very, diverse picture when you look at like how fact-checking organizations try to accomplish their work.
It's very cool what you guys are doing, because there's that common phrase where they say, the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth even gets its shoes on. And what you guys are doing at the IFCN is kind of create these shoes that are always on, and you guys can scale these fact checks across these tech platforms instantly once they're made available. And I think that it needed to be done, and it's very important work. I have two last questions for you that I ask every guest that comes on the podcast. But before I get to those, why don't you give listeners where they should go to follow you and IFCN's work?
Sure, absolutely, and thanks a lot for this, opportunity. The easiest way is actually just, Google IFCN or International Fact Checking Network. We have a number of resources at poynter.org. So if they go to poynter.org, they can see IFCN's brand on the top of the page, so they can easily, click on that and even see our annual breakdowns of our financials, our transparency document, our list of verified signatories, our methodology. And the funders that we work with, our advisory board members, all those resources are out there. If they are using smartphones, they can also use our chatbots. We have chatbots available in English, in Spanish, in Hindi, in Portuguese, in Spanish. So we try to be basically available everywhere. And I will be more than happy to be, an asset and resource for those who like to know more. So maybe you can also share my email address with those who like to, reach out to me. It's basically baybars@poynter.org. Yeah, I mean, there are tons of resources out there. And if there is an organization watching this podcast to know and interested in knowing more about how to become an IFCN verified signatory, we also have resources, webinars, pre-recorded ones, and then quarterly live ones, so they can also, be up to date on our, projects, on our, trainings, on our conferences. So that will be amazing to catch up with those who are more, interested in following up.
Okay. And do you have like a 30-second elevator pitch that let's say you're in the elevator with Jack Dorsey and you've got, 10 floors to go down. You've got 30 seconds to try to convince him that he should be plugged into the IFCN. What does that pitch sound like, if you could?
Well, in this, world with social distancing and masks, probably 30 seconds would be that, efficient in an elevator. But if we had that chance with at least, like, let's say, Jack Dorsey, I would say, definitely, exploring partnership with fact checkers would be really beneficial for his company. I mean, that's definitely the case for all internet companies out there. It's funny that you just bring the example of Twitter, because Twitter is actually the only network that we haven't had any chance to explore something more structured. We have great colleagues that we are in touch with there, but we haven't been able to explore a partnership model where fact checkers can work with Twitter the way similar, not necessarily the same, but in a similar way with Twitter, because at the end of the day, it's a product that tech companies need more than often, and we have seen that very recently in terms of like the conversations around like labeling, the legitimacy of label. People are more comfortable in knowing more about how they are presented with something. So if they see a label on a platform, I think there's a big value in making sure how those labels are put there, which fact-checking organizations was there helping Twitter, if ever, in their editorial needs. I know that it's more than 30 seconds, but I haven't been able to do an elevator pitch lately due to this lockdown. But I will say probably working with fact checker helps to tech companies both in the short and long term.
All right. Well, Jack Dorsey, you heard it. So let's get on it. Last two questions for you here, Baybars. Question number one is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
Well, I think I'm a believer, but I'm not an investor, so I don't have any Bitcoin. So if that will be the future of our financial institutions, I'm probably gonna be happy that I was like a believer at some point, but very unhappy that I wasn't an investor. So I probably would like to keep this chances. Either way, I'm gonna be probably satisfied with my judgment. Either way. But I think there is big, future for big future in blockchain because what we see lately in all conversations is, about trust. People likes to, there's a big need in trust, towards financial institutions, news organizations, political organizations, political parties. So blockchain, I think, more than the Bitcoin itself, has a big, potential for us to explore a human-centered, trust-seeking activity powered by technology, which can be a big part of our future when it comes to securing that need of trust.
Cool. I'm glad to know that somebody at the IFCN is aware and looking into blockchain, because I do think that there will be opportunities down the road. Last question for you. Are we living in a simulation?
I don't think so. I just like to, play Flight Simulator at times. And it looks like, simulators should be something that that you're in a simulation, because it was very evident for me that I was in a simulation. I was trying to, fly in an airliner from Los Angeles to Tokyo. But, jokes aside, I think I'm a strong believer in that what we do has impact on other people's lives. So we need to be very, mindful about our own actions, even though it's not it's a simulation or not. But I think it has what we do has a big impact on other people's daily lives. That's how I personally feel myself motivated to work in the fight against misinformation, because as I earlier said that people have all the right whatever they want to believe in, but as long as they don't harm other people. So I think we should be able to come up to the conclusion that it is for our own better good that we have a better and healthier public discourse, not necessarily leaning towards any side in the political spectrum. But it's something that we should be, finding comfortable for our future, generations to rely on the internet for their own, all activities that they do on a daily basis, actually.
Great. Well, with that, Baybars, thank you for coming on this episode of the Credder Podcast. I hope listeners go and follow your work at the IFCN, and hopefully Twitter and the other platforms that are holding out start knocking on your door. And wish you and IFCN the best of luck.
Thank you, Chase. Thank you so much.